The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of city rain that had fallen just hours before. Streetlights flickered, casting a dim glow on the damp pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a familiar sound in a city that never slept. On a quiet corner near a high-end cafe, a man sat on the sidewalk, his back against the cold brick wall. His clothes were tattered, his shoes worn to the sole. A frayed beanie covered his head, and his beard had grown wild, unkempt. He held out a small cardboard sign, the words scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Just trying to eat. Anything helps." If you're watching this, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this story. Because what happens next, nobody saw coming. The man's name was Nathaniel Nate Carter. To the world around him, he was just another nameless figure in the city's growing homeless population. Someone people walked past without a second glance. But what they didn't know was that Nate wasn't homeless at all. Beneath the ragged clothes and dirt-smudged face, he was a man worth over $50 million. He owned multiple businesses, had a seat at powerful investment tables, and could have been sitting in a penthouse sipping wine instead of sleeping in the streets. But he was here for a reason that, by the end of the night, would shake this city to its core. The first person to notice him wasn't a kind stranger offering help. It was Officer Travis Holloway, a cop with a reputation, not a good one. He was the kind of officer who patrolled this part of town with a smirk, always looking for an excuse to flex his authority. He didn't see homeless people. He saw problems. And Nate was about to be his next target. "Hey!" Holloway's voice cut through the quiet night, sharp and commanding. He stomped toward Nate, his heavy boots splashing through a shallow puddle. His partner, Officer Delgado, followed closely behind, looking less eager but not about to challenge his partner's actions. Nate barely lifted his head. He had seen this kind of thing before. He had studied it. He had watched countless videos of police harassing people who looked just like him. He had read the statistics. He knew how it went. And now he was about to live it firsthand. "You can't sit here," Holloway barked. "Get up." Nate exhaled slowly, glancing up at the officer with calm, unreadable eyes. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice steady but quiet. Holloway sneered. "Did I ask if you were bothering anyone? You're loitering. You can't just set up camp wherever you feel like." Nate kept his expression neutral. "I'm just resting. I'll move soon." Holloway's jaw clenched. He didn't like that answer. Not from a man like this. Not from someone who looked like he belonged anywhere but near a cafe that catered to the city's wealthiest. He pulled his baton from his belt and tapped it against his palm. A silent warning. Delgado shifted uncomfortably. "Holloway, maybe we just—" "Nah." Holloway cut him off. "He needs to go." Then, without another word, Holloway reached down, grabbing Nate's arm with more force than necessary. Nate tensed, but he didn't resist. Not yet. The people sitting inside the cafe barely noticed. A few glanced outside, saw the cops, and quickly looked away. Some customers adjusted their expensive watches, sipped their lattes, and went back to their conversations. To them, it was nothing. To Nate, it was everything. Holloway yanked him up roughly, shoving him toward the curb. "Move!" Nate's heartbeat remained steady. His mind stayed sharp. Every part of this had been expected. Every word, every action. He had prepared for this moment. And soon, Holloway was going to wish he had never laid hands on him. Nate stumbled forward as Officer Holloway shoved him, his worn-out sneakers barely gripping the wet pavement. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he kept his breathing slow and steady. Not yet, he told himself. Delgado glanced around nervously, scanning for witnesses. He didn't like how Holloway handled things, but he also wasn't about to challenge his partner in the middle of the street. Besides, it wasn't like anyone cared. Homeless people were invisible in this city. Except Nate wasn't invisible. And he wasn't homeless. A sleek black car idled across the street, its tinted windows concealing a pair of sharp eyes watching everything unfold. Holloway didn't know it yet, but he was making the biggest mistake of his career. "Where you headed?" Holloway snapped as Nate steadied himself. Or do you even have anywhere to go? Nate exhaled slowly. He had seen this play out too many times. If he didn't leave, Holloway would escalate. If he walked away too fast, it would be suspicious. There was no right move, so he made the only move that mattered. He stayed calm. "I'll move," Nate said evenly. Holloway smirked. He liked when people obeyed. It made him feel like he had control. But just as Nate turned to walk away, Holloway grabbed his shoulder again. Harder this time. "Actually," Holloway said, grinning now, "let's see some ID." Nate went still. He could feel the moment shifting. His real ID, safely tucked away in the high-rise penthouse he owned, would have told a very different story. It would have revealed his name, his wealth, his influence. The kind of influence that could end Holloway's career with a single phone call. But the ID in his pocket, the one he had chosen to carry tonight, told a different story. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled it out. A worn, state-issued ID with a fake last name and an old address. It was legally obtained but deliberately unremarkable. Holloway snatched it and squinted at the details, then scoffed. "No permanent address? Figures." He turned to Delgado. "Run his name. See if he's got warrants." Delgado hesitated but pulled out his radio. As he relayed the name, Nate kept his face unreadable. He had taken precautions. There was nothing on that ID that would raise alarms. But he also knew how this game worked. Holloway wasn't looking for a reason to let him go. He was looking for an excuse to take him in. A minute passed. Then another. Delgado's radio crackled to life. "No warrants. No record." Holloway clicked his tongue in annoyance. Then suddenly he smirked. "You got anything on you I should know about?" Nate narrowed his eyes. "No." Holloway's grin widened. "Good. Then you won't mind if I check." He didn't wait for permission. Before Nate could respond, Holloway spun him around, forcing his arms behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. People passing by started to slow down, watching but not interfering. A few took out their phones, recording from a distance. Inside the cafe, a businessman in a tailored suit glanced up briefly, then went right back to his laptop. Just another homeless guy getting arrested. Or so they thought. Delgado shifted uncomfortably. "Holloway, come on, we don't have. You see how jumpy he got when I asked?" Holloway cut him off. "I bet he's got something." Delgado hesitated but didn't stop him. Holloway roughly patted down Nate's jacket, then his jeans. He reached into his pockets, searching for anything he could use as an excuse. Then he froze. His fingers had brushed against something small and metallic. He pulled it out, frowning. A sleek black key fob, one that obviously didn't belong to someone sleeping on the streets. Holloway held it up, turning it over in his hand. It wasn't just any key fob. It belonged to a luxury car. And not just any luxury car. The one parked across the street. Nate watched the realization dawn in Holloway's eyes. The officer's grip tightened on the key. "Where'd you get this?" he demanded. Nate held his gaze, calm as ever. "You already ran my name," he said. "You tell me." Holloway's jaw clenched, because the truth was sinking in. This wasn't adding up. And deep down, Holloway knew he had just screwed up. Holloway's smirk was gone. His fingers clenched around the key fob as he stared at Nate like he was seeing him for the first time. The key didn't belong to some beat-up old car. It was the kind that unlocked something expensive. Something most people in this part of town couldn't even afford to look at, let alone drive. And across the street, sitting beneath the glow of a streetlight, was the exact car it belonged to. A sleek black Rolls-Royce. Holloway's grip tightened on Nate's arm. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice low, almost dangerous. Nate tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Why don't you check?" Holloway's eyes flickered with something: hesitation, confusion, maybe even a little bit of fear. But he masked it quickly, yanking Nate forward. "Let's go." Delgado frowned. "Where?" "The car." Holloway's voice was sharp. "If this guy stole it, I want to know." Nate let them drag him toward the Rolls-Royce, moving without resistance. He could feel the shift happening. The moment where everything Holloway thought he knew was about to be flipped upside down. The onlookers on the sidewalk watched with interest now. Phones were still recording. Something about this situation didn't feel normal anymore, and people could sense it. Holloway reached the Rolls-Royce, gripping the key fob so tightly his knuckles turned white. He pressed the unlock button. A soft beep. The car's lights flashed. The doors unlocked. Silence. Delgado took a step back, eyes wide. No way. Holloway's mouth opened, then closed. His mind was racing, trying to find a way to explain what just happened. Homeless men didn't own luxury cars. This wasn't how things worked. This wasn't how the world was supposed to be. Nate turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. Something wrong, officer? Holloway snapped out of it, his grip tightening on Nate's arm. You steal this? He growled. His voice wasn't as confident now. Nate exhaled through his nose, something close to amusement flickering in his eyes. You ran my name, remember? No record, no warrants. You really think I'd be dumb enough to steal a car and leave the keys in my pocket? Holloway hesitated. Delgado looked between them, his own face pale. Then, before Holloway could say another word, the back window of the Rolls-Royce rolled down, and the man inside spoke. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Holloway froze. Delgado stiffened. Sitting inside the car was an older black man, dressed in a crisp suit that probably cost more than Holloway's entire paycheck. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something powerful. Nate didn't even have to look. He already knew who it was. Malcolm Grant, a man who didn't need an introduction, a billionaire investor, a business mogul, a man who sat at the table with politicians, CEOs, and world leaders. And, most importantly, the person who had sent Nate out here tonight. The tension in the air was suffocating. Malcolm tapped his fingers on the door. That man you just put in cuffs? His voice was smooth, deliberate. He's one of my business partners. Holloway's stomach dropped. Delgado looked like he was about to pass out. Nate tilted his head slightly. Should I tell him, or do you want to? Holloway swallowed hard. Tell me what? Malcolm leaned forward just slightly. His voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than Holloway's badge ever could. That man you just harassed, he said, is Nathaniel Carter. Holloway blinked. The Nathaniel Carter, Malcolm continued, owner of Carter Industries, multimillionaire, philanthropist. The words hit like a freight train. Holloway's breath caught in his throat. Delgado took a full step back, eyes darting between Nate and Malcolm, because now it all made sense. The car, the calmness, the way Nate hadn't panicked, hadn't begged, hadn't reacted the way Holloway expected him to. Because Nate had never been afraid of him. Because Nate had let this happen. And now, Holloway was realizing he was the one who should have been afraid. Holloway's fingers twitched. He could still feel the weight of the handcuffs locked around Nate's wrists, still feel the sting of his own arrogance burning in his chest. Nathaniel Carter, a millionaire, a business mogul, a man who could ruin him with a single phone call. Delgado was already stepping back, his expression somewhere between shock and horror. Holloway Holloway wasn't listening. His mind was scrambling for a way out. That doesn't prove anything, he said quickly, gripping Nate's arm tighter, as if holding him harder would undo everything. Maybe he stole the identity, maybe. A low chuckle interrupted him. It wasn't Malcolm. It was Nate, still cuffed, still standing in the same ragged hoodie and worn-out jeans. But somehow he was the one in control now. Nate slowly turned his head toward Holloway, his dark eyes locking onto the officers. That's funny, he murmured. You didn't need proof when you assumed I was just another homeless nobody. But now you want to be sure. The words sliced through the air like a knife. Holloway's jaw clenched. His grip faltered. You're done, man, Delgado muttered under his breath. He wasn't even trying to hide his fear anymore. You screwed up. And he had. Holloway had gone too far, and now the weight of his mistake was pressing down on him like a boulder. The cameras were still rolling. The crowd was still watching. But most importantly, Malcolm Grant was still there, witnessing every second of it. The billionaire sighed, shaking his head. "Officer Holloway," he said, his voice laced with something almost amused, almost pitying. "I take those cuffs off. Now." For the first time that night, Holloway hesitated. If he let Nate go, it meant admitting he was wrong. But if he didn't, he had the sickening feeling he was about to find out exactly how much power a man like Nathaniel Carter had. His hands shook slightly as he fumbled for the key. He forced himself to unlock the cuffs, barely able to meet Nate's eyes. The metal fell away with a soft click, and Nate rolled his wrists, stretching out the stiffness. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he took a step closer to Holloway. The officer stiffened. "Let me guess," Nate said quietly. "You thought you could treat me like garbage because you assumed I had nothing." His voice wasn't loud, but every word cut deep. "You thought no one would care, that no one would stop you." Holloway didn't respond. He couldn't. "You didn't see a person," Nate continued. "You saw less than that. Someone you could push around. Someone who wouldn't fight back." A long pause. Then Nate smiled. It wasn't friendly. "Bet you're wishing I was just another homeless nobody now, huh?" Holloway swallowed hard, his entire body rigid. Nate didn't wait for an answer. He turned to Malcolm, who was still watching with quiet amusement. "Mind if I get a ride?" Nate asked casually. Malcolm smirked. "Of course." Without another glance at Holloway, Nate stepped toward the Rolls-Royce, sliding effortlessly into the back seat. The door shut with a quiet click. Malcolm gave Holloway one last look. Not anger, not even disgust. Just disappointment. Then the tinted window rolled up, and the car pulled away from the curb, leaving Holloway standing in the street, his fists clenched, his mind racing. Because he had just humiliated himself. On camera. In front of the whole world. And worst of all, Nathaniel Carter wasn't done with him yet. Holloway stood frozen in the street, his mind racing, his pulse pounding in his ears. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on him all at once. This was bad. Really bad. The crowd had seen everything. The cameras had recorded everything. And now that the truth was out, that Nathaniel Carter wasn't some random homeless man but a millionaire with connections, Holloway knew what was coming next. He was about to lose everything. Delgado turned to him, his face pale. "Holloway," he muttered under his breath, glancing around at the people still watching. "What the hell do we do?" Holloway swallowed hard. He knew what he wanted to do. Get in his cruiser, drive away, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But there was no running from this. Not when Nathaniel Carter was involved. Not when Malcolm Grant had seen it all. The Rolls-Royce had disappeared down the street, but the damage was already done. Within hours, maybe minutes, the footage would be everywhere. The police chief would see it. The mayor. Every major news station. Holloway's career wasn't just in danger. It was over. And as that realization settled in, something else hit him. He had done this to himself. He hadn't been set up. No one had tricked him into abusing his power, into treating a man like dirt just because he thought he could get away with it. He had made that choice on his own. And now he was about to pay for it. Nate leaned back in the plush leather seat of the Rolls-Royce, exhaling slowly. He flexed his wrists, feeling the lingering tightness from the handcuffs. Malcolm sat across from him, watching him with quiet amusement. "Well," the older man said, "that was certainly eventful." Nate huffed out a dry chuckle. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" Malcolm's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I had a feeling." Nate shook his head. "You set me up." "I gave you an opportunity," Malcolm corrected. "And you took it." Nate let the words settle. He knew Malcolm well enough to understand what had really happened here. This wasn't just some social experiment. It wasn't about proving a point. It was a test. Malcolm wanted to see if Nate was still the same man he had been before. The one who knew what real struggle felt like. The one who understood power wasn't about money or status, but about character. And Nate had passed. Malcolm studied him for a moment, then leaned back. "So," he said, "what do you want to do about Holloway?" Nate didn't answer right away. He could already picture it. Holloway's name on every news channel, his face plastered across social media. The outrage, the demands for justice. He could destroy the man's entire life with one call. But he didn't. Instead, he pulled out his phone, opened a note, and typed in a name. Then he slid the phone to Malcolm. Malcolm glanced at the screen, then lifted an eyebrow. "You sure?" Nate nodded. "Yeah, I am." Malcolm smirked. "You really are a different man than the one I met years ago." Nate chuckled, shaking his head. "I just know revenge isn't the answer." Malcolm nodded approvingly and picked up his phone. "I'll make the call." The fallout was immediate. The footage of the incident spread like wildfire. News stations picked it up. Social media exploded. People demanded Holloway be fired, arrested, held accountable. And then, just when it seemed like his life was about to be completely destroyed, a statement was released. Nathaniel Carter himself had spoken out. He didn't call for Holloway's badge. He didn't demand legal action. Instead, he called for reform, for training, for accountability, for real, lasting change within the department. And as the pressure mounted, the police chief had no choice but to act. Holloway wasn't fired. Instead, he was reassigned, pulled from active duty, and placed in a mandatory program focused on addressing bias, power abuse, and accountability. And as for Nate, he kept doing what he had always done. Helping, building, giving back. Because at the end of the day, power wasn't about money. It was about what you chose to do with it. And he had chosen to make a difference. Even for the man who had once tried to tear him down.